He smells like poverty. Move him to the back. That's what the flight attendant said out loud over the intercom about an elderly black man seated quietly in first class. Not whispered, not accidental, broadcast for the entire cabin to hear. And no one said a word. This isn't a story about turbulence in the air. It's about turbulence no one talks about. The kind that wears a uniform. The kind that smiles while it strips away dignity. A man nearly 80, with a fully paid first-class ticket, was mocked, relocated, and reduced in front of a plane full of silent witnesses. But the twist? He never once raised his voice. He didn't have to, because when the plane landed, their world fell apart. You think you've heard stories like this? Think again. What happens next will change everything you believe about justice, power, and who's really in control. Tell us, what would you have done if you were sitting 3 rows away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. And if this hit you where it hurts, hit subscribe. Because this isn't the only flight where the truth flies higher than anyone expects. The chill bit through the thin wool of Silas Rowe's overcoat as he stood alone at the bottom of the air stair, the cold creeping through his gloves and into his knuckles. It was 7 degrees Celsius, but the wind howling across the tarmac made it feel closer to freezing. He adjusted his scarf, looked up at the plane's open door, then glanced at his printed boarding pass again, as if to reassure himself it still said First Class 2C. A few minutes earlier, he had watched half a dozen other passengers board the aircraft without pause, their coats unzipped, their conversations loud and casual, their path unobstructed by anyone. When his turn came, Silas had approached with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 8 decades of life, extending his boarding pass to the tall blonde woman stationed at the door. Veronica Foster, lead flight attendant. Her name was pinned neatly to her crisp uniform above a cluster of golden wings. She glanced at him, paused, and then, without a word, turned, tapped her earpiece, and pulled the aircraft door shut. Just like that. The hiss of hydraulics sealed him out. Silas blinked. The cold sank deeper. His breath puffed visibly in the air as he stepped back, unsure whether to speak, knock, or simply wait. Seconds passed. Then, a minute. The tarmac agent, confused to see him still there, jogged over and tapped lightly on the hatch from the inside. Veronica opened the door, her face unreadable. "Are you lost, sir?" she asked flatly. Silas, caught off guard, raised the paper pass. "No, ma'am. This is me. First class." She looked at it, exhaled like she'd been inconvenienced. "Proceed." Quickly. No apology, no explanation. As he stepped into the cabin, warm air wrapped around him, but it didn't melt the ice in her tone. Before he could go further, she stepped in front of him again. "One moment," she said, holding up a hand. "We have a quick screening protocol." Silas blinked. "Screening?" "Yes, for security reasons. Remove your glasses, please. And your hat. Also shoes. Open your coat." She was already motioning behind her for assistance. The other passengers in the cabin, those who had just breezed by her, turned in their seats to watch. Silas's ears burned. "Is this usual?" he asked, voice careful. She smiled without warmth. "Standard for certain profiles." Profiles. The word rang like a drop coin. Silas removed his glasses, his wool hat, even his scuffed shoes. He stood there in his socks on the cold cabin floor, holding his coat open like a schoolboy during inspection. Veronica scanned him like he might be hiding something, then pointed at the pen in his inner pocket. "What's that?" "Just a pen," he replied. She took it, turned it over like it might explode, then handed it back. "All right," she said, stepping aside. "You may proceed." He gathered himself and walked slowly down the aisle, heart beating faster than he wanted it to. The other passengers didn't speak, but their stares said enough. One man lowered his phone, clearly having recorded part of it. A woman whispered to her husband and shook her head. No one intervened. No one asked if he was okay. Silas didn't stumble, didn't falter. He moved as he always did, quiet, deliberate, bearing the unbearable with grace. He found seat 2C, stowed his carry-on beneath the seat in front of him, and sat. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them in his lap. Not from age, From rage. Not loud, not red-hot, but the kind that brewed like pressure under the skin. He had paid full price for this seat. He had followed every instruction. Yet the air around him vibrated with suspicion, as if his very presence was the mistake. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. But the scent wasn't the expected comfort of recycled lavender-scented air. It was sterile, cold, laced with contempt. Veronica moved on as if nothing had happened. Another passenger requested champagne. She smiled easily and complied. Silas opened his eyes and stared ahead. There was no champagne for him. No water. No welcome. Just silence. But Silas Rowe had been through worse than silence. He knew how to wait. How to endure. What he didn't know was that this wasn't just another microaggression. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would shake the entire airline industry to its core. Silas Rowe sat motionless in C2C, his hands still folded in his lap, his eyes tracking the gleaming silver cart being pushed slowly down the aisle by a young male flight attendant. When it reached row 1, the process began. White linen was unfurled across tray tables like ceremonial cloth. Glass flutes filled with Veuve Cliquot bubbled cheerily in polished hands. Menus were presented with a curated smile. Veronica hovered behind the attendant like a hawk shadowing its prey. Her voice had warmed several degrees since takeoff, laughing softly with passengers, pausing to compliment the tailored cuff of one gentleman's jacket or fussing over the sparkling water preference of another. As the cart neared Silas's row, the attendant paused, eyes flicking toward his supervisor, awaiting the silent nod. But Veronica's head barely turned as she spoke without looking in Silas's direction. "Skip to C." Her voice was low, clipped. The attendant hesitated, his hands twitching slightly on the handles of the cart. "Ma'am," he asked quietly. Veronica gave a look that required no elaboration. The cart bypassed Silas's seat, a full step forward. Then, as if correcting course, the attendant pulled something from a side compartment. A plastic tray, the kind used in economy. On it sat a sealed water cup, a reheated chicken wrap in a cardboard sleeve, and a napkin thin enough to see through. The tray clattered down in front of Silas with an audible thunk. The sound cut through the soft clinks of champagne and silverware like a slap. No menu, no linen, no offer of wine or appetizer. Silas looked at the tray, then up at the attendant. The young man avoided his gaze and quickly moved on. From behind, a voice broke the air like a whip. "Hey, I thought we were flying first class, not running a charity shuttle." A burst of laughter followed. The voice belonged to a man in his late 40s, seated in 3A. He had a ruddy face and a neck that vanished into his shoulders like a rolled ham. Rick and Vale. Silas recognized the type instantly. Expensive watch, louder opinions. The kind of man who confused confidence with cruelty. Rickon leaned into his companions, gesturing forward with his fork. "My old man would have never made it past security dressed like that. Said if someone can't afford dignity, they sure as hell didn't buy that seat." His friends laughed again. Loud, unfiltered. The way people laugh when they feel protected by power and status. Veronica did nothing to stop it. In fact, she smirked. Not openly, but just enough. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, as she turned slightly toward Rickon's row and said, "Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you, sir." She hadn't said a word to Silas since boarding. He reached for the tray slowly, his fingers steady despite the white flame of humiliation blooming beneath his ribs. He peeled back the plastic wrap, revealing a sandwich that was half soggy, half burnt. He took no bite, simply closed the tray again and set it to the side. The cabin around him returned to its rhythm, light chatter, the clicking of cutlery, muted laughter. But the silence at 2C was weighty, unnatural, like the still air before storm. Silas adjusted his seat back without asking for help. The buttons were stiff, intentionally or not, and he struggled for a moment before settling. No one asked if he needed assistance. A few rows ahead, a child asked his mother why the man with a gray hadn't gotten a tablecloth. The mother whispered back something vague and dismissive. Even children could sense the disparity. Silas turned his head slightly, just enough to see Veronica pouring wine for a woman in a red dress. Their eyes met briefly. Veronica did not blink. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly for mid-flight comfort, passengers began adjusting their seats for rest or scrolling through devices. Across the aisle, diagonally from Silas, sat a woman in her early 30s with tightly curled blonde hair and oversized sunglasses she hadn't taken off since boarding. Her name was Tasha Linwood, a boutique consultant from Scottsdale who documented every moment of her luxury lifestyle for a following of 42,000. To her, the flight was another curated detail to feed the algorithm, a visual trophy. She had noticed Silas early on, of course. Everyone had. But unlike the rest, she saw something else: opportunity. When Silas reached above his seat to retrieve a small pouch from the overhead bin, moving slowly, hands shaking slightly from stiffness, not nerves, Tasha discreetly activated her phone camera, angled low to avoid detection. The footage she captured was innocent in truth. Silas unzipping the compartment, adjusting his footing, trying to free his bag wedged between two larger suitcases that clearly weren't his. But Tasha had already decided how she would frame it. By the time the plane crossed over Kansas, her phone had trimmed the video, zoomed into Silas's hands, and overlaid text that read, "Caught this shady moment in first class. Who lets people like this up here?" Her caption included the emoji eyes and the hashtag not first class vibes. She sent it not to her public feed, but into a private group chat titled Sky Queens, a digital sorority of influencers, flight crew, and a few wealthy exec wives. Within minutes, the post had dozens of laughing emojis and GIFs, followed by a message from an account labeled VX Operations, an off-duty flight attendant who replied, "Just the type who loses someone's Chanel bag midair. Happened before." Another chimed in, "I'd log him as C3, combative potential, odd behavior." Tasha smiled to herself, refreshed the thread, and watched the damage bloom. Moments later, Veronica received a message ping on her crew tablet. She turned toward the galley, eyes narrowing. The message contained a screen capture of the altered video and a short instruction. Observe passenger 2C. Consider proactive security tag. Level 3. Trust your judgment. It was unsigned, but clearly internal. Veronica didn't hesitate. She accessed the in-flight operations screen and flagged Silas as a monitor passenger, a code typically reserved for aggressive behavior or intoxication. It was unofficial, non-binding, but it triggered a protocol. Upon landing, he would be randomly selected for post-flight debrief by airport security. Sometimes it led to questioning, sometimes detainment. The label alone was enough to make someone miss a connection, ruin a reputation, or, in Silas's case, quietly imply danger without ever saying the word. As she entered the designation, she glanced toward Silas. He had returned to his seat and was reading a small, worn paperback with a cracked spine. His posture was calm, unaware. Veronica didn't feel guilt, only a strange, cold satisfaction. Now there was justification. Now she had backup. She whispered something to the co-attendant near the beverage station, who nodded subtly. Word moved quickly. In row 3, Rick and Vale received the clip from someone in the same group chat and let out a snort. "Well, look at that," he muttered to the man beside him. Knew he was up to something. The lie moved like a stain, spreading quietly, invisibly. No alarm bells, no confrontation. Just whispers and unchecked assumptions, reinforced by a pixelated video and an unchallenged narrative. Silas kept reading. He didn't see Tasha sneak another glance his way, this time recording only her face, adding a fake whisper. "He's still here, y'all. They said they're flagging him. Glad they're watching." She would delete the video before landing, but the damage wouldn't delete with it. Veronica now moved through the aisle with the self-satisfaction of someone who believed she held not just authority, but righteous purpose. With Silas silently seated, unaware of the digital whisper campaign swirling around him, she prepared the next step with a veneer of professionalism hiding razor-edged intent. She stepped into the service alcove and tapped her comm device to speak privately with the forward galley attendant, forgetting or pretending to forget that the PA system remained partially active. Her voice, meant for one, echoed in a brittle hush through the first-class cabin. "We've got a relic class situation in 2C, she said dryly, a smirk twisting the words. "Just move him near the lav when we do the shift. He's better off there, less visible, less fragrant." The words, once spoken, couldn't be undone. A collective hush fell over the cabin as her voice crackled out of the ceiling speakers. Rows of heads turned toward Silas. The phrase hung like smoke. Relic class. Not economy. Not coach. Something worse. A designation invented to degrade. A few passengers snorted. One woman gasped. But no one said a word to challenge it. Veronica froze for a fraction of a second, realizing what had happened, then snapped off the mic with a practiced flick. Her face returned to composure in a blink. She stepped out as if nothing had happened, refusing to acknowledge the transmission, and resumed her duties. But the damage was immediate and intentional. Rick and Vale leaned out into the aisle, making no effort to whisper. "Hell, I thought I was the only one smelling it." His companion choked back laughter. Another woman clutched her scarf closer to her face and angled her body away from Silas's row. Across the aisle, Tasha Linwood pulled out her phone again, pretending to text, but actually recording reactions. She added a fake subtitle in her mind for later. First class or forgotten class? Even those who hadn't heard clearly now filled in the blanks. It wasn't just exclusion anymore, it was ostracization. Silas had remained composed throughout the flight so far, weathering insult after insult with the calm of a man too experienced in humiliation to react. But this time, his eyes rose slowly from the book in his hands. He glanced around the cabin. He saw the sudden shifts in posture, the subtle ways people turned away, adjusted, shrank from him. He didn't ask what had been said. He didn't need to. He knew. A moment later, Veronica returned to his row with a thin smile that didn't bother pretending to be real. "Mr. Rowe," she said, her tone clipped and official, "we've had a passenger express concern about the airflow in this section. We'd like to relocate you just temporarily to the rear of the cabin near the lavatory until we complete a filtration check. Standard precaution." Silas looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "No one else is being relocated." Veronica's smile froze. "It's just for comfort and safety, sir." "Whose comfort?" he asked, voice even. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the rear. Two other flight attendants appeared, one male, one female, standing as silent reinforcement. Not aggressive, not physical, but present enough to imply that resistance might be seen as escalation. Silas stood, not because he agreed, but because he understood the unwinnable optics of the moment. He collected his things, adjusted his scarf, and walked the length of first class, with every eye following him. The walk was slow, dignified. He didn't slump. He didn't shuffle. But the echo of their silence trailed him like a shadow. When he reached his new seat, it was everything she'd intended. Beside the restroom, beneath a blinking overhead light, against a wall that rattled with engine noise. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles now, offering water or blankets, speaking in low tones that were meant to signal calm. It was in these quiet hours that cruelty often slipped through unnoticed, wrapped in the illusion of routine. At the back of first class, just beside the lavatory door that groaned every time it opened, Silas sat in a seat that refused to recline properly, wrapped in a chill that clung to the corners of the cabin. No one made eye contact with him anymore. He was an absence more than a presence now, a discomfort the crew had collectively agreed not to address. One by one, passengers received noise-canceling headphones, sealed in crisp plastic, passed along with a polite smile and a short explanation about the onboard entertainment. A few guests chuckled as they tried them on, impressed by the quality. In his seat, Silas watched the distribution move closer like a tide. Row 1, Row 2, Row 3. Each person accepted their headphones with ease. But when the tray reached his row, it stopped short. Veronica stood beside it. She glanced at him, then at the cart, then reached down and pulled a set of headphones from the bottom. No plastic wrapping, cable tangled in tight spirals. One ear cup cracked and held together with clear tape. She handed it to him with a look that could barely be described as neutral. "Here," she said, her voice lowered, eyes darting past him. "This should work just fine." Silas took it in his hands. The cord was frayed near the jack. He tested the fit. One side hissed static. The other gave nothing. "I believe this set's broken," he said calmly. Veronica's lips curled in the faintest smirk. "People like you don't strike me as audiophiles, Mr. Rowe," she said, her tone deliberately conversational. "But I suppose Mozart doesn't speak to everyone." The line hung between them like wire. Silas didn't respond. He placed the headphones on his lap and said nothing. It wasn't about Mozart. It never had been. The insult wasn't about music, it was about place. About who belonged in the quiet, cultured world of first class, and who did not. Veronica moved on without a second glance. Moments later, another attendant passed by with a carafe of coffee, moving quickly between rows with practiced efficiency. She approached Silas's aisle with a flick of her wrist to steady the pour, but as she passed his seat, the carafe tilted just enough to send a splash of hot liquid across his chest. It wasn't scalding, barely more than warm, but it soaked the front of his shirt, running into the folds of his sweater like a deliberate stain. The attendant gasped, but it was sharp, rehearsed. "Oh my goodness," she said, already reaching into her apron. From it, she pulled a single napkin, folded, used. A faint lipstick smear visible in the crease. "Here," she added, pushing it into his hand. "You'll be fine." She didn't wait for him to reply. She didn't bring water or offer to take the garment or apologize. She vanished as quickly as she had appeared, replaced by the silence of those around him pretending not to see. Silas sat back, the wet fabric clinging to his chest, the napkin limp in his fingers. He didn't blot the stain. He didn't move. He had endured worse. But something deep beneath his ribs had begun to tighten, like rope pulled slowly through a loop, knotting more with every breath. He looked toward the front of the plane where Veronica now leaned in to speak with another flight attendant, laughing quietly. Inside the aircraft, lights had been lowered in preparation for overnight rest. Passengers reclined peacefully under blankets, their faces soft in sleep or illuminated faintly by screens. But for Silas Rowe, the journey had grown colder, louder, and lonelier. He remained seated near the back of first class, barely moving except to adjust the dampness of his shirt, which had now dried into a patchy, wrinkled mess. The overhead reading light above him was still on, bright, concentrated, and intentionally untouched by the crew. While the rest of the cabin bathed in dim, ambient comfort, his space stood out like an interrogation cell. The brightness wasn't simply inconvenient, it was pointed. No one had asked if he wanted it off. No one had offered a pillow, a blanket, or the smallest gesture of concern. The attendant who had spilled coffee earlier hadn't returned. Veronica passed by several times, attending to others with the grace of a seasoned professional, but she never acknowledged his presence again. Even silence can speak with surgical cruelty. Then came the soft rustle of nylon slacks and perfume, the subtle signs of approach that Silas had grown used to registering over the decades. A new figure knelt beside him, Flight Attendant Grace, a younger crew member with carefully curled auburn hair and a badge too pristine to be seasoned. She spoke softly, almost conspiratorially, as though pretending this were a kind exchange. "Mr. Rowe," she said, her voice coated in faux empathy. "I just wanted to check on you. Everything okay?" Silas looked at her, not hostile. "Just tired." "I'm fine," he replied, his voice low. "Just resting." Grace smiled in that overly rehearsed way, the kind that never touched the eyes. "That's good to hear," she said, pausing briefly. "You traveling for business or pleasure?" The question seemed innocent, but the undertone was there, barely buried. Silas didn't answer immediately. "Neither," he said. "Just going home." Grace tilted her head, as if trying to parse something deeper. "And where's home, if I may ask?" "Chicago," he replied. "Originally?" she asked, pressing. "Originally's never just one place," he answered. Grace let out a short laugh that sounded practiced. Right. Of course. Did someone book the ticket for you?" The shift in her tone was slight but deliberate. It was no longer conversational. It was an inquiry. No, he said. I booked it myself. Online? She asked again, still kneeling. Through the airline site? Silas's eyes didn't leave hers. Is there a reason for these questions? Grace blinked, flustered but trained. Oh no. I was just making conversation, sir. You know, we don't get a lot of solo senior travelers in this section. Thought maybe someone had surprised you with a gift. The implication hung in the air. Not just that Silas didn't belong, but that he couldn't have possibly afforded it on his own. That someone else, someone more acceptable, had made this seat possible for him. It wasn't curiosity. It was subtle disbelief. No gift, he said evenly. I earned it. Grace stood slowly, adjusting the hem of her uniform, then added almost too cheerfully, Of course you did. Just checking in. Let me know if you need anything. She left before he could reply. Silas turned back toward the window, where night had swallowed the landscape below. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass. An old man in a seat he had paid for, being treated like a mistake in the system. No water, no blanket, no rest. The light above him continued to blaze down, buzzing faintly, unblinking. As the cabin grew quieter, as breaths deepened and heads fell against pillows, he remained upright, fully awake. Attendants made their rounds with clipped instructions and fake smiles, collecting service items with the kind of urgency that comes from routine. Veronica passed Silas one final time and didn't speak. She didn't check his belt or tray. She didn't offer him anything, just moved on like he wasn't there. He sat still, composed, a silent fixture in the corner of their conscience. But the silence was about to shatter. As the plane banked slightly toward the east, the intercom clicked on with the signature double tone that usually preceded landing instructions. But instead of a flight attendant's voice, it was the captain. His tone was formal, a notch more deliberate than the standard script. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "on behalf of our crew and Skylux Airlines, we'd like to extend a special welcome and thank you to all our passengers on today's flight." A pause, and then, additionally, we are honored to have on board a senior advisor from the United States Federal Committee on Aviation Ethics and Procurement Oversight. A beat passed. Then, a wave of whispers. Seats shifted. Heads turned. A few passengers looked around as if expecting someone to stand up or wave. Veronica's posture straightened. Grace glanced around, confused. Even Rickenvale blinked twice and muttered, "Wait, someone important's on here." Silas didn't move. He remained as he was, hands folded over his lap, eyes forward, face unreadable. Then, from row 2A, a woman in her 50s slowly rose to her feet. She had sharp gray hair pulled into a bun, wore a tailored navy pantsuit, and had remained quiet the entire flight. She turned toward the back of first class, her voice clear and unhurried. "Do any of you know who you've been ignoring? Who you've humiliated?" The question cut through the fog of landing procedure like a blade. Everyone stilled. The engines continued to hum. Veronica blinked but didn't speak. "That man," the woman said, pointing directly toward Silas, "is not only a decorated veteran, an accomplished civil contractor, and former state senator. He is the current federal chair of the Aviation Oversight Committee, the one that decides which airlines get billion-dollar contracts and which don't." A sharp gasp broke the silence from a young woman in row 3. Rickenvale's mouth hung slightly open. Tasha, who had just been adjusting her makeup for touchdown, froze mid-swipe. Grace's face drained of color. Veronica said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The woman stepped toward Silas's seat, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just with purpose. "Mr. Rowe," she said softly, "I'd like to personally thank you for your decades of service. On behalf of the department and the countless lives you've impacted through your integrity, welcome home." Silas looked up at her. Something flickered behind his eyes, but he said nothing yet. Around him, the cabin had gone completely still. The petty cruelty of the night now hung in the air like a stain on white cloth, impossible to deny or erase. The revelation didn't come with anger, didn't erupt with shouting. It was quiet. That quiet that comes before accountability, before consequences. Veronica stepped forward, as if to say something, perhaps salvage herself with a last-minute excuse. But the woman in navy held up a hand gently. "Don't," she said. "Don't make this worse." The voice of the captain returned briefly, thanking passengers once again and reminding them to remain seated while the aircraft taxied to the gate. But no one was really listening anymore. The tension that had built over hours of calculated humiliation now curdled into a fragile disbelief. Those who had whispered, laughed, or looked away were suddenly redoing the math in their minds, rewriting the story they thought they were part of. And amid it all, Silas Rowe remained as he was, unmoved, silent, shoulders straight, as if nothing at all had changed. But everything had. Row 4 Seat D, a bespectacled man with a laptop still open, leaned sideways and muttered to the woman beside him, "I think I recognize him. That's Harold Green, or at least that was the name when he chaired the oversight panel back in 2018. He ran that emergency audit on North Star after the racial discrimination scandal. The whole executive board was replaced because of his recommendation." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on Silas. "You're right. That's him. Same build, same calm. I saw him on a C-SPAN ethics panel last year. They called him the Quiet Hatchet." Another passenger nearby chimed in. "Didn't he reject 2 major lobbying contracts just last month?" The FAA's watchdog praised him for cutting corruption out of the procurement system. Murmurs rose like wind. Names and titles collided. Harold Green, Silas Rowe, one and the same. A man who had walked onto this plane as a presumed nobody and now sat like a lit fuse in the center of a cabin full of flammable shame. Tasha Linwood stared at her phone screen, her hand frozen over the delete button. It was too late. The message thread was already full of screenshots, hashtags, and speculation. The leaked recording of Veronica's Relic class comment had already found its way online. Someone from the ground crew had uploaded the entire intercom audio to a whistleblower subreddit. A journalist from a local Chicago news affiliate, who just so happened to be sitting in economy on the same flight, was live tweeting the unfolding scandal. The headline had broken before the cabin doors even opened. Breaking: FAA advisor humiliated by crew on Skylux flight. Discrimination allegations erupt mid-air. Below it, a subheadline read, $257M government contract under review following incident. At the front of the plane, Veronica's tablet pinged with a soft alert. Her fingers trembled as she opened the crew app and read the top line. Review status: emergency contract hold. FLT 211 flagged for incident report. HQ response pending. She looked up, eyes darting to the captain, who had already been pulled aside by a gate marshal waiting just beyond the door. Grace, the younger attendant, now stood frozen, her hand halfway to unbuckling her harness, face pale as frost. Rick and Vale slumped in his seat, eyes lowered, the bravado long gone, replaced with a heavy silence that sat on his chest like a stone. The doors opened. A security detail stepped on board, not for an arrest, not for a scene, but for a greeting. The woman from earlier, the one who had announced Silas's identity, now led a small delegation onto the aircraft. She handed a document to the captain and nodded towards Silas, who had already stood, not with drama, but with dignity. The passengers parted without a word. No resistance, just the tension of people trying to remember how to breathe. But Silas didn't march down the aisle with a speech. He didn't glare or raise his voice. He walked with slow precision past each row, eyes forward, his silence louder than anything the intercom had said. As he reached the front, a small voice called out. A boy no older than 10, seated beside his father, whispered, "I tried to give him water, remember?" By the time the crew of Flight 211 stepped off the plane, faces tight, eyes averted, each gripping their service bags with white knuckles, corporate had already issued a statement, cold and neutered. Skylux Airlines has launched an internal investigation into reports of misconduct aboard Flight 211. We remain committed to the highest standards of inclusivity and professionalism. But no statement could stop what had already begun. Within 2 hours, the Department of Transportation placed an emergency freeze on Skylux's northeastern government contracts. citing credible evidence of discriminatory behavior against a federal ethics officer. The $257 million deal, slated for 5 new interregional hubs, was suspended indefinitely, pending a federal inquiry. Markets responded immediately. Skylux shares dropped 14% before midday. Travel forums erupted. Frequent flyers posted screenshots of canceled memberships, demanding refunds. Longtime Platinum passengers posted clips from a flight, some taken without sound but layered with captions like "This is what racial bias looks like in first class." And the spotlight, brutal and bright, fell hardest on Veronica Foster. It didn't take long. A high school classmate posted a screenshot of Veronica's now-deleted Facebook post from 2017, a status mocking diversity hires in aviation, paired with a stock photo of a black woman in a pilot's uniform. That post alone was shared over 100,000 times in 24 hours. Former coworkers began commenting anonymously on HR sites, recounting stories of Veronica subtly discouraging certain passengers and joking about seating codes no one dared question. By day's end, she was trending on multiple platforms. Her image, once polished and sharp in the airline's promotional material, now appeared beside headlines like "Skylux Racism Scandal Explodes" and "The Face of Discrimination at 30,000 feet." The company tried to contain it. HR requested that she submit a written statement. PR advised silence. Legal recommended cooperation. But it was too late. She was summoned to headquarters the next morning and met not with a disciplinary board, but with a security escort and a termination letter printed on cold white stock. Her badge was deactivated. Her pension suspended pending legal review. Her international work visa, required for flying routes through the EU, was revoked on grounds of reputational harm to the airline. She walked out of the Skylux building with no uniform, no severance, and no future in commercial aviation. The union didn't defend her. No one did. Grace, the younger attendant, was placed on administrative leave pending further interviews. She issued a statement of apology through her attorney, claiming she did not fully understand the context and regrets not speaking up. Passengers who had laughed or whispered during the flight found themselves doxxed or harassed. Tasha Linwood lost 2 brand sponsorships after screenshots of her private group messages leaked. Rick and Vale deleted his business profile within 48 hours. None of them spoke publicly, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew the world had finally decided not to listen. Skylux's CEO held a press conference under harsh lighting and cold stares. He offered condolences. He promised training, reform, external audits. But no one asked about change. They asked about contracts, about numbers, about damage control. Meanwhile, Silas Rowe gave no interviews. He released no statements. He simply returned to work the following Monday, walking into a quiet Washington office with the same quiet dignity he had carried on the plane. Inside his office, he declined every media request. He instructed his staff not to retaliate. "Let truth work," he told them. "It doesn't shout, but it carries." And it did. The inquiry into Skylux widened. Several flight crew members came forward, detailing a pattern of internal bias. Training modules were suspended. Contracts were reviewed. A new oversight subcommittee was proposed in his name, the Roe Standards for Passenger Equity Act, aimed at protecting vulnerable travelers and elevating accountability in federally funded airlines. Veronica, now back home in a small apartment in Bakersfield, watched it unfold through her phone screen. Each headline another blow she couldn't deflect. 12 months had passed, yet Veronica still woke up sometimes to the phantom weight of her old uniform, the phantom sound of jet engines and crew briefings, the muscle memory of greeting passengers she once filtered in her mind into categories: respectable, tolerable, questionable. Now, instead of reviewing flight plans and assigning service roles, she spent her mornings wiping down counters and folding paper napkins into corners of laminated menus at a small cafe on the edge of Baltimore's Old City Pier. Her apron smelled faintly of burnt toast and cinnamon syrup. Her hair, once tied in a tight regulatory bun, now curled loose under a $10 cap that didn't bear wings or logos. She didn't complain. Not anymore. Life had already done the talking. When the Skylux scandal broke, it cost her everything. Job, future, community. Her inbox turned from praise to threats overnight. Friends grew quiet. Some blocked her altogether. Others messaged late at night asking, "Why didn't you just let it go?" But the real damage hadn't come from others. It came from within. Because every time she clicked on an article that named her as the embodiment of prejudice in corporate aviation, she remembered not just the humiliation, but the face of the man she had tried to make small. The man who said nothing while everyone else said too much. The man who had simply existed where she had decided he didn't belong. And now, in a cafe that didn't care what she used to be, Veronica swept crumbs from the floor and smiled politely at customers who didn't bother to look at her name tag. Until that morning. It was quiet, midweek, post-rush. The regulars had come and gone. She was clearing a table near the window when she saw him. Same posture. Same wool coat, though worn softer now. Same calm. He sat in the farthest booth, book in hand, a pair of glasses perched low on his nose. Veronica's breath caught. For a second, she wasn't in the cafe. She was back on Flight 211, standing over his seat, handing him a broken headset and pretending it was procedure. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up a mug. She didn't want to approach, but policy demanded it. She walked to his table, heart pounding in her throat, and set down a fresh cup of black coffee. He looked up, not startled, just aware. Their eyes met. Recognition passed between them like a ripple, but he didn't speak. She placed the mug down gently, whispered on the house, and turned away before her voice could betray her. He said nothing. She didn't expect him to. She didn't deserve it. She returned to the counter, busying herself with trays that didn't need cleaning, with receipts that didn't need sorting. Minutes passed. Then, when she finally turned around again, his booth was empty. Only the coffee remained, half full, still warm, and the receipt, folded once, resting beside the mug. She approached slowly, unsure if she even wanted to read it. But she did. Her name wasn't on it. No threat. No sermon. Just a single line, handwritten in steady cursive, beneath the total. Sometimes those who are humiliated don't need to respond. Life will teach what justice doesn't have to shout. She stood there for a long time, holding the slip like a verdict handed down in silence. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't post a redemption story. But she did something she hadn't done in over a year. She opened a book on ethics and read it, not to excuse herself, but to understand what she had refused to before. She showed up to work the next day, early. She didn't smile to fake anything, but she listened more. She looked people in the eye. She gave the best table to a woman who walked in wearing a scarf and carrying a heavy bag, who most of the staff would have seated near the kitchen. Change didn't come in fireworks. It came in fragments, quiet moments. And so, Silas Rowe never needed to see her again. He never had to demand an apology. He didn't need her remorse to be known. His message, left in ink and absence, had already done enough. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives like it. What part of Silas's journey struck you the most? Was it the quiet dignity, the turning point, or the final moment of silent justice? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Let's talk about what justice truly looks like when no one expects it.